everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Thing Beyond the Fence. I moved to rural Kentucky about a year ago, and even now, I still haven't fully adjusted to the endless trees and isolated pockets of land that stretch as far as the eye can see. Coming from the bright, sandy beaches of Florida, this new life is like stepping into a completely different world, quieter, darker, and somehow older. I live in my parents' house, nestled in a quiet area beside a highway, but even that road doesn't bring much comfort. There's only a couple of gas stations and a $1 store within a 20-minute drive, and beyond that, just miles of empty farmland. Behind our house sits a 150-acre field, fenced off but accessible by a small gate. And while it technically belongs to a farmer, I've never seen the man in person. He only appears during planting season, and even then, he comes and goes like a ghost. But ever since we moved in, strange things have started happening. Unexplainable lights in the sky, shrill noises that don't sound like any animal, and a growing sense that something is always watching. For months, I brushed it all off. After all, I've heard plenty of stories. Small towns love their tales of ghosts and cryptids. But what really got to me was the silence. Every night after 9 p.m., the entire neighborhood shuts down. No porch lights, no backyard barbecues, not even the soft glow of televisions in living rooms. It's like the world just stops. Back in Florida, people were always outside late, laughing, walking dogs, or throwing impromptu parties. But here, once the sun goes down, it feels like I'm the only one left awake. My friends and I used to hang out on the back porch around midnight, laughing and stargazing while we smoked and let the night sink in. We'd hear rustling in the fields nearby, maybe a raccoon or a deer, we told ourselves. But one night, something screamed from the dark, a blood-curdling shriek that chilled us to the core. We never went back out there after that. Then came the night everything changed. I was taking scraps to our compost bin at the back of the property. It was late, around 11:18 p.m., and the only light came from our back porch, casting long, thin shadows over the grass. As I walked toward the compost, I felt it, the prickling on the back of my neck, the sensation that something was watching, waiting. I stopped, squinting into the dark, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, the rustling in the underbrush. Close, too close. I pulled out my phone, shook it to activate the flashlight, and aimed the beam toward the field. At first I saw nothing but the waving tips of soybean plants. Then, something caught the light. Eyes, glowing red and unblinking, set into a small, hunched form. It couldn't have been more than 4 feet tall, crouched low to the ground, and it was staring right at me. I don't remember screaming. I don't even remember running. But I must have, because suddenly I was inside, locking the door and sprinting down to the basement where my room is, safe, windowless, and sealed from the outside world. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it an animal? A trick of the light? But deep down I knew better. The next evening, I forced myself to go back outside while the sun was still up. I walked to the same spot, scanning the area for anything. Berries that could reflect light, maybe, or broken glass. But there was nothing. Just soybeans and silence. That's when I saw my neighbor outside and called him over, asking if he'd ever seen anything unusual around here. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Everyone I know stays indoors after dark. There's tales of hellcats and night crawlers roaming around. Just don't be out too late." Since then, I've started noticing even more things. Strange, looping noises that sound like a bird call, but somehow artificial. The sound moves when I follow it, always staying just out of reach, like it knows I'm chasing it. Even the neighborhood dogs have started acting up, barking at nothing, howling in the middle of the night, and then falling dead silent like something has just passed by. The same night I saw the red eyes, Those hound dogs were barking like mad. It's like they knew. I've started keeping a spotlight on the porch and a night vision camera facing the fields, hoping to catch whatever this thing is. I've been tempted to set up trail cams too, though I haven't gotten around to it yet. But something is out there. I know it. My mother didn't believe me at first, at least not until I told her everything. When I finished explaining what I'd seen, she went pale and told me that not long ago, she had been outside talking to a friend when she heard someone climb over the fence. She didn't see anyone, but she heard the footsteps getting closer fast. She bolted inside without looking back. Our metal fence is about 5 feet tall, and there's no easy way to climb it without making noise. But something had done just that, and it scared her enough that she's been keeping the porch locked ever since. That's when I remembered something else, something I had forgotten. There's a sinkhole on the farmer's land, about 80 from the edge of our backyard, and inside it is a small cave. I never thought much about that cave before, but now I can't stop thinking about it. What if that's where it came from? What if something is living in there? Something old, something unnatural. I did some digging and found that the land used to be government property back in the 1960s and 80s. There's no record of what they did with it, just blank spaces and mentions of unavailable data. There's even a man-made crater somewhere nearby. Our property might have been part of it. My curiosity is fighting with my fear. I want to know what's going on, but I'm also terrified of what I might find. If the government was doing experiments here, who knows what they left behind? Last night, I heard the chirping noise again, that eerie loop that plays like a broken recording. I stepped outside, scanning the yard with my flashlight, but as soon as I moved toward it, the sound drifted away, deeper into the woods, and then silence. No insects, no frogs, no night birds, just dead, suffocating silence. It's the kind of silence that feels wrong, like even nature itself is holding its breath. I turned around and walked straight back inside. I'm not ashamed to admit that I locked every door, checked every window, and even blocked the basement steps with a heavy chair. I'm trying to be logical about this. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe my brain, fueled by stories and late nights, is just creating something out of nothing. But then again, red eyes don't just appear in the middle of soybean fields. I've considered going out there again, really investigating, but a part of me is afraid of what I'll see if I do. What if it's still there? What if it's waiting? I keep hearing stories from other locals, too. People who've seen things. People who have lived here their whole lives and never go out after dark. And now I understand why. So here I am, writing this down not just as a warning, but as a plea. If anyone else has seen something similar, especially around Kentucky, please let me know. I need to know I'm not alone. I need to believe that there's an explanation for all of this. I've lived here for a year now, and every night I go to bed hoping that the noise doesn't come back, that the red eyes stay hidden, that whatever crawled over that fence never decides to come closer. I don't want to live in fear, but I also don't want to end up being one of those stories people whisper about in the dark. Story 2. The man who wasn't my father. It was a quiet morning in our house, the kind of silence that settles in after everyone leaves for work or errands, and you're left with a familiar hum of appliances and distant birdsong. My dad had left around 4 in the morning, just as he always did for his early shifts, and my mom had left about 2 hours ago to pick up a few things from the store. I thought I was completely alone. The house felt still, the kind of peaceful that made me feel safe and lazy at the same time. I got out of bed with the intention of grabbing a snack from the pantry and maybe scrolling on my phone a bit before starting anything productive. But as I walked through the hallway and approached the living room, something strange caught my eye. Sitting on the couch, or rather slouched just low enough that I could only see the top of his head, was what looked unmistakably like my father. At first I wasn't scared, just confused. I hadn't heard the door open. No footsteps, no keys jangling, no car pulling in. Just him, suddenly there. I called out, "Hey Dad, when did you get back?" His voice responded, calm and familiar. "Oh, I only came back about 10 minutes ago." And yet, something was off. The tone was too slow, too deep, like someone trying to mimic his voice. And the phrasing, "I only came back about 10 minutes ago," sounded rehearsed, like a line from a bad play. Still, I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe he was just tired, or maybe I was imagining the weirdness because I had just woken up. I nodded and started heading toward the pantry when he called out again, this time asking, "So, what time is Mum getting back?" Again. I answered casually, "I don't know. She said she was checking out, so probably another 30 minutes. But it was the way he responded that made me stop walking. He said, "Just wondering, kid." The word kid. It wasn't something my dad ever called me. Not once. It hit my ears wrong, too casual and too distant all at once. And again, the voice wasn't quite right. I turned slowly, a weird, nauseating feeling building in my chest. I walked back to the living room, and as I stepped around the couch, I froze. The couch was empty. There was no one there. I looked everywhere, the hallway, the front door, even the floor behind the coffee table, but there was nothing. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside, already knowing what I wouldn't see. My dad's car was not in the driveway. The space where he always parked was completely empty. I wasn't imagining things. I'd heard him. I'd talked to him. I'd seen the shape of his head over the back of the couch, but he wasn't here. Panic set in slowly, like cold water pouring down my spine. I stood there, gripping the curtain, staring at the empty driveway while my mind raced through every logical explanation. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe I'd sleepwalked into a memory. Maybe the light had played a trick on my eyes, but none of those thoughts could explain the voice. None of them accounted for the words, the conversation, the strange questions that weren't quite right. When my mom returned home a short while later, I didn't say anything. I wanted to, but I couldn't find the words. It felt too fragile, too unreal to speak aloud. I ate my snack in silence, the taste turning to ash in my mouth, and pretended everything was fine. But that wasn't the first time something strange had happened in that house. There had been others, little things that I had brushed off as dreams or tricks of memory, lights flickering when no one was near the switch. My name whispered softly from another room when I was alone, cold spots in the hallway, sudden and brief, shadows that seemed to linger too long after I turned my head, and now this. A man who looked and sounded almost, but not quite, like my father, sitting where he shouldn't be, asking questions he shouldn't have asked, and disappearing without a trace. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the doubt. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined the whole thing? But deep down I knew. I knew because when I closed my eyes, I could still hear the voice echoing back. "Just wondering, kid." I could still see the way the top of his head poked over the couch, motionless, too still. I could feel that weight in the air, the feeling like something was watching, waiting, wearing a mask that barely fit. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. I kept the bedroom door closed and locked. I placed little things in front of the door. Shoes, books, a plastic bin, so I'd know if someone opened it while I was asleep, and every morning I'd wake up and check, heart pounding. But nothing ever moved. It's strange the way fear creeps in and makes a home in your mind. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It sits in the corner of your room and watches. It waits for you to forget, and then it reminds you with a glance, a sound, a missing shadow. I don't know who or what I spoke to that morning. Maybe it was something pretending to be my father. Maybe it was just a part of the house that wanted to be acknowledged. But whatever it was, it knew things. It knew when I was alone. It knew how to sound almost right. And that's what scares me the most, how close it came to fooling me completely. In the days that followed, I found myself listening closely to voices around me. My father, my mother, friends on the phone. I listened for the subtle differences, the imperfections, and I found myself questioning everything. Was that really her voice? Did he always talk like that? Paranoia wrapped itself around my thoughts like ivy, pulling tighter each day. And then one night, I heard it again. The same voice, just beyond the edge of sleep, calling my name softly from the living room. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I stayed in bed, eyes closed, pretending not to hear, pretending it wasn't real. But I heard it. I know I did. I've considered telling someone, really telling them. But what do I say? That I saw someone who looked like my father sitting on our couch, that I talked to him, only for him to vanish, that I might be going crazy, or worse, that something unnatural is inside our home. No one would believe me. Maybe I wouldn't believe me if it hadn't happened to me. So for now I live with it. I keep the lights on. I avoid the living room in the early hours. I check the driveway every morning, just to be sure. And I never, ever respond when I hear my name whispered from an empty room. Story 3. The Babysitter's Warning. I was 15 when I first took on the job of babysitting for a family that lived just a few streets away from my school. It wasn't something I was particularly prepared for, but I needed the money, and the mother knew my mum well. They had 3 kids, 2 boys and 1 girl, and the oldest was only a year or 2 younger than me. The mom had recently started picking up extra shifts at work, and her husband, always described as a large but gentle man, was also gone most of the day. At first I was nervous. I had cousins, sure, but I wasn't used to being responsible for kids on my own, especially for hours at a time. Still, I took the job, figuring I'd get the hang of it. And in many ways I did. The kids were high energy, especially the younger 2, but I managed. What I didn't expect was that the scariest part of that house had nothing to do with the children. The daughter, the middle child, was obsessed with horror movies, strangely obsessed. She'd often beg to watch scenes from ones I knew weren't meant for her age. She reenacted the scary parts with her dolls and tried to get her little brother involved too. He, on the other hand, was wild in his own right. He once tried to set the Christmas tree on fire just to see what would happen. I found myself on constant high alert, making sure nobody was hurting themselves or each other. When they got too rowdy, I would threaten to call their mum, which usually got them to settle down. But over time, I noticed something odd. When I mentioned their dad instead, they would go silent immediately. It wasn't fear exactly, but something deeper. They took me seriously in a way that seemed too intense for normal mischief correction. That should have been a red flag. One afternoon, the little boy was being particularly defiant, throwing tantrums over every little thing. I mentioned I would call his father, and his mood shifted so drastically that I found myself genuinely unsettled. I ended up making the call, and the dad answered, saying he'd be home soon. His voice was calm, too calm. When he arrived, I got my first real look at him. He was tall, towering even. He had to stoop slightly to enter the doorway, and his presence immediately sucked the air out of the room. He greeted me with a nod, and I apologized for calling him from work. He just shrugged it off. We sat on the couch to go over the next week's babysitting schedule, and everything felt normal on the surface. But there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. He stared at me. His eyes didn't waver, even when we weren't speaking, and I noticed the oldest child seemed particularly anxious around him. At one point, the dad asked the oldest to run to the corner shop for something, but the kid hesitated, made up excuses, and practically begged me to go instead. I didn't mind. It gave me a break from the tension in the room, but it left me wondering what made the boy so reluctant. After that visit, I kept my interactions with the dad minimal. We didn't speak much. When I babysat, it was mostly over the phone or through text with the mom. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message cancelling a babysitting date I had already planned around. I was a little annoyed but let it go. The mother said she'd still pay me for the missed time and invited me over to collect the money. When I visited, something felt off. The atmosphere in the house was different, tense, like the aftermath of a storm no one was allowed to talk about. She seemed distracted as we spoke, offering me tea and nervously glancing toward the hallway. I didn't pry, though I felt like I should have. She handed me my pay, more than I was owed, and thanked me for everything, suggesting gently that maybe it was best I didn't return for a while. I nodded, unsure what to say. I hadn't seen the dad since that day on the couch, and the idea of not going back felt like a strange relief. Days passed. Then, I came home one evening to find my mum pacing the living room, her face pale, eyes wide. She rushed to hug me before I could even set my bag down. My phone had died, so I hadn't received any of her messages. She'd been trying to reach me frantically. She thought I was at the babysitting job. She thought something terrible had happened, and when I asked why, she told me. The news had broken that afternoon. The father had been arrested. He had killed someone at work. A violent, unprovoked assault, but it didn't stop there. During interrogation, he admitted to long-standing abuse toward his wife, with hints that there may have been more. Things unsaid, dark and unconfirmed. Police said his type was small, dark-haired, pale girls. My blood ran cold. That was exactly how I looked at the time. My mother had been terrified I was with him when he snapped. That realization shook me to my core. I remembered sitting beside him on that couch, how small I felt next to him, how his eyes never blinked, how the oldest child had pleaded with me not to be alone with him, and suddenly it all made sense. The fear, the stiffness, the obedience when his name was mentioned. They weren't afraid of getting grounded. They were afraid of something far worse. I stopped babysitting for them immediately. I couldn't bring myself to go near the house again, but a week later, I received a text from the mother. She said I had left a few books behind and offered to return them. I agreed to meet her outside the house. When I saw her, my heart broke. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days, holding herself together with sheer willpower. She hugged me and thanked me for being good to her kids, but asked that I not return, not for my safety, but because people had started targeting the family. She didn't want me to get caught in the crossfire. I nodded, tears in my eyes, and took my books. That was the last time I saw her. Years have passed, and I still think about those kids. I've stayed in touch with them, quietly. The oldest had a rough time in high school, bullies, whispers, judgment. I tried to help when I could, but there's only so much you can do from a distance. The daughter grew up fast, a fierce protector of her siblings, and the youngest, well, he doesn't remember much, thankfully. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't mentioned calling their dad that day, if I hadn't sat on that couch, if I had been left alone with him more than once. The thought chills me, because I know without a doubt something terrible could have happened. It's strange how a job as simple as babysitting can leave such a deep, lasting scar. I started that job thinking it would just be a side gig, a way to earn some extra money after school, but it became something far darker, something that stayed with me into adulthood. It taught me to trust my instincts, to listen to what's not being said. It taught me that danger doesn't always come with sirens or warnings. Sometimes it wears a smile. Sometimes it calls you kid, or hands you a glass of water, or thanks you for helping with dinner. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you get away before the smile fades and the mask comes off. Story 4. The grandmother in the blue sweater. The day had started off beautifully, filled with sun, sea breeze, and the kind of warmth that only a few hours at the beach can give you. My skin still held onto the heat of the sand when I returned to my grandmother's house, a small but cozy place just a few blocks from the shore. She was usually always home, either knitting on the couch or humming softly as she watered her flowers on the porch. But today, when I stepped inside, something felt off right away. The front door was unlocked, something she never did, even if she was just walking across the street. Her keys were missing from the usual hook, and the quiet of the house felt too deep, too still. The air inside hung heavy, like it was holding its breath. Her usual spot on the couch was empty, and the TV was off. I stood there for a second, scanning the room for signs of where she might have gone, then called out, "Grandma?" What I heard next didn't quite make sense. It wasn't a clear voice, more like a muffled noise from the back of the house, somewhere between a call for help and a sigh. Alarmed, I rushed down the hallway, my footsteps muffled against the old carpet. I glanced into her bedroom. Empty. Then into the bathroom. No one there. I called again, louder this time, but there was no answer. I walked back through the bedroom, slower now, scanning every corner, every shadow, and that's when I saw her. She was lying on the floor beside the bed, just for a moment. I could see her clearly, her familiar blue sweater, her favorite pair of jeans. Her head was turned slightly, eyes closed, peaceful but wrong. I blinked in confusion, and in that brief second, she was gone. Just gone. There was nothing on the floor, no one in the room. It was like she had never been there. I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. It hadn't felt like a dream. It hadn't been shadow or imagination. I had seen her clothes, her form, her face, and now she wasn't there. My mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the long hours in the sun had tired me more than I realized. But even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the image of her lying there, perfectly still, wearing the exact outfit I had seen her in earlier that week. I turned and walked back into the kitchen, where I spotted something that made me pause again. A bright neon yellow notepad now sat on the table. It hadn't been there before. Written on it, in her unmistakable handwriting, was a short note. Gone across the street, be right back. I stepped outside, still rattled, and spotted her talking cheerfully with the neighbor on the porch across the way. She was alive, she was fine, and she was wearing a completely different outfit, an orange blouse and light pants. I didn't say anything about what had just happened. How could I? How do you tell someone you just saw them lying lifeless in their room when they'd been outside laughing with neighbors the whole time? I nodded politely at them and walked back inside, letting the screen door slam a little louder than I meant to, just to remind myself that I was still here, still awake, and still trying to ground myself in something real. For days afterward, I kept going over it in my head. Was it a vision? A hallucination? A glimpse into something that hadn't happened yet, or something that had happened already? I've always been a skeptical person, someone who needs proof and logic to make sense of things, but this experience didn't leave me with anything I could explain away. It was too vivid, too detailed. The texture of her sweater, the way her hair fell across her cheek, the sunlight spilling across the bed just so. These weren't the fragments of a tired mind. They were impressions left behind like footprints, and try as I might, I couldn't ignore them. I didn't tell my mum. I didn't even tell my best friend. I didn't want to sound crazy, and more importantly, I didn't want to make it real by speaking it aloud. But deep inside, something had shifted. I found myself watching my grandmother more closely, checking on her more often, waiting for signs that something was wrong. And every time she coughed, every time she moved a little slower, my heart clenched with worry, because that image, her lying still, alone, would flash in my mind again, and I'd wonder if I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, a premonition, a warning, a shadow of what was to come. One evening I finally worked up the courage to mention it to my grandma, very gently, very carefully. I told her that I had come home from the beach and had a strange feeling, and that for a moment I thought I had seen her asleep on the floor. She looked at me long and hard, her expression unreadable, and then said something I'll never forget. Sometimes the house shows you things, not always to scare you, sometimes just to prepare you. I stared at her, unsure of what she meant, but she didn't say anything else. She just went back to folding laundry, as if what she'd said was the most ordinary thing in the world. I often wonder if she's had her own visions, if she's seen people where they weren't, heard footsteps when no one was there. She never speaks about such things openly, but every now and then, I catch her glancing down the hallway with that same unreadable look. We've never brought up the incident again, and maybe that's for the best. Some things, I've learned, aren't meant to be understood. They're meant to be felt, remembered, respected. The house had shown me something, and I chose to listen, not with fear, but with a quiet kind of reverence. And now, even though the years have passed, I still remember that day with perfect clarity. My grandmother is older now, slower but still sharp as ever. She still wears the blue sweater from time to time, and whenever she does, my heart skips a beat. But she's here. She's alive. And maybe that's all that matters. Maybe the vision wasn't about death at all. Maybe it was about reminding me to see her, really see her, while I still had the chance. Story 5. The Van in the Quarry. There was a time during my teenage years when my friends and I would spend our evenings exploring the quiet, forgotten corners of our town. One of our favorite spots was an old quarry, now turned into a national park, nestled deep in the countryside of the UK. It wasn't heavily patrolled, especially after sunset, which made it the perfect place for bored teenagers to hang out, talk, and occasionally cause a little mischief. The quarry had high stone walls, hidden trails, and stretches of gravel that seemed to swallow sound. It felt detached from the world, like a place between places. And maybe, just maybe, that's why it attracted the people it did. Over the years, we became familiar with the patterns of the place. The usual cars parked in hidden corners, couples looking for privacy, and the occasional group of friends smoking in silence. But there was one constant that never changed: the old motorhome. It was always parked in the same spot, tucked back near the tree line at the edge of the quarry. Far from the main trail, the vehicle itself looked ancient. Faded paint, rust creeping along the door hinges, and windows so dark you couldn't see inside even in daylight. What stood out the most was the massive antenna mounted on the roof. It was comically oversized, something you'd expect on a military vehicle or maybe a surveillance van. We joked about it often, spinning stories about spies or survivalists hiding in the shadows. But we never dared to go near it. Something about that van radiated stillness, a kind of heavy, unsettling silence that made even the loudest among us go quiet when we passed it. We'd glance at it from a distance, whisper about it, and then move on. One night, after hours of sitting around waiting for something exciting to happen, one of our friends suddenly asked why we'd never messed with the people in the motorhome. We had a reputation for harmless pranks, blaring siren noises from our car speakers, flashing lights to mimic police, watching from the bushes a startled couple scrambled to hide whatever they were doing. It was stupid, sure, but it gave us something to do. So when someone suggested we try to spook whoever lived in that van, it seemed like the perfect way to shake off the boredom. The plan was simple. All four of us would surround the motorhome and shout "earthquake" while shaking the sides of the vehicle. Juvenile, definitely, but at the time it felt thrilling. We crept up in the dark, hearts racing, trying to stifle our laughter. The quarry was quiet that night, eerily so. No cars, no wind, not even the rustle of trees. We approached the motorhome from all sides, careful not to make a sound. Then, on the count of 3, we pounded on the metal and screamed at the top of our lungs, "Earthquake!" We kicked the tires, slammed the back door, and waited for the inevitable angry shout, or at least a startled response. But there was nothing. No movement. No sound. The vehicle sat there motionless, indifferent to our intrusion. We stopped, exchanging confused glances. It was like no one was inside. It felt anticlimactic, almost disappointing. Then we heard it, the slow creak of the motorhome door opening. We all turned toward the sound, our laughter instantly dying in our throats. The door swung open with a soft groan, and one by one, people began to step out. Not quickly, not with panic or anger, but with an eerie calmness. They didn't speak. They didn't run. They simply walked out as though nothing had happened. What made our blood run cold was what they were wearing, each of them dressed in black cloaks, their faces obscured by featureless black masks. There were 8, maybe 9 of them, and they moved in total silence. No phones, no flashlights, no signs of modern life, just those blank faces turned toward us, standing there, watching. We ran. No discussion, no hesitation, just pure instinctive flight. We bolted back to our car, jumped in, and sped out of the quarry as fast as we could. The headlights lit up the path in shaky beams, and none of us spoke until we were miles away. When we finally looked back, the motorhome was still in sight, and the figures were still there, unmoving, silhouetted against the dim candlelight flickering from inside. Yes, candlelight. That explained why we had never seen electric light coming from the windows. They lived without power, without noise, hidden in plain sight. But why? And more importantly, what were they? We speculated endlessly afterward. Maybe it was a religious cult, or maybe just people trying to live off the grid. Maybe they had seen us coming and decided to play a trick of their own. But no theory sat comfortably in our minds. It was the silence that got to us, the utter lack of reaction, the deliberate, slow pacing of their emergence, as though they had done it 100 times before. They weren't startled. They weren't amused. They were something else entirely. And the way they stared, completely still, their faces unreadable under the masks, it felt like a warning. We never went back to the quarry after dark again. In fact, none of us returned to that spot at all. The motorhome remained, as far as we knew, and we heard rumors of others who had seen figures in black near the tree line or strange lights flickering in the dead of night. But no one we knew dared to approach it again. Sometimes I still wonder what we interrupted that night. Was it a ritual? A meeting? Something not meant to be seen? The older I get, the more I realize how close we may have come to something that wasn't meant for us, something ancient and secret and deeply out of place in our world. Looking back, I feel a strange mix of fear and gratitude. Fear for what we saw and what we still don't understand. Gratitude that nothing worse happened. We could have been followed. We could have been taken. We could have simply vanished, like so many unsolved stories begin. But instead, we were left with a memory, a vivid, lingering image of 9 silent figures standing outside a candlelit van, watching us with faces we'll never forget and silence we'll never fully explain. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and some motorhomes are best left alone in the dark. Story 6. The Boy from the Water. There's something unexplainable about the way children perceive the world, how they speak to the empty corners of a room, laugh at shadows, or hold conversations with no one in sight. I used to smile at these moments when my son was younger, chalking them up to imagination and dreams, but then something happened that made me question everything I believed about the boundaries of life and death. My son was born on July 13th, a date I'll never forget, not just because of his birth, but because of the eerie coincidence tied to it. Exactly 1 year prior, a close friend of my ex-partner had passed away on that same day. His name was Dean. He was young, kind, and full of life, taken tragically when he jumped into cold water on a hot summer afternoon. His body, shocked by the sudden temperature change, went limp, and he drowned almost instantly. It was a sudden and heartbreaking loss, especially for my son's father, who had been close to Dean since childhood. So when our son was born a year later, on the very day of Dean's death, we both felt a strange weight in the air. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was more like the feeling that something had come full circle, that life had found a way to echo through time. We decided to honor Dean's memory by giving our son his name as a middle name. It felt right, meaningful. At the time, my son's father and I were still together, but we eventually parted ways when our boy was just 6 months old. He moved away, visiting now and then. But our son didn't grow up hearing stories about Dean. I never spoke of him, figuring that when the time was right, his father would be the one to explain. As my son grew, I noticed the usual oddities, the way he'd laugh at corners of the room, wave at empty space, or whisper to someone just out of sight. I dismissed most of it as harmless, the quirks of a creative child. But then came the night he called for me, not scared but insistent. I went into his room expecting sleepwalking or a forgotten nightmare, but he was wide awake, his small body sitting upright under the blanket, his eyes alert. "There was a boy in the middle of my room," he said. I blinked, unsure I had heard him right. "A boy?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. He had long hair and was lying in water. He was smiling at me. I stood frozen, my heart skipping a beat. I tried to steady my voice and asked if he'd been dreaming, but he shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I woke up because I heard a splash." He described the boy in detail. Wet hair, calm face, a smile that wasn't scary, just gentle. I didn't know what to say. I comforted him, tucked him back into bed, and sat by his side until he drifted back to sleep. My mind, however, didn't rest that night. I kept replaying his words, the specificity of what he'd said, the certainty in his voice. The next day, when his father came to pick him up for the weekend, I told him what had happened. He went quiet, staring at me in disbelief. I suggested, cautiously, that maybe it was time to tell our son about Dean. Maybe the moment had arrived whether we were ready or not. He nodded slowly and promised to talk to him before bringing him home the next day. When my son returned, he was cheerful, bouncing into the house as though nothing had happened. But his father pulled me aside and told me what had occurred. He had sat down with our son and explained that his middle name came from someone very special, his friend Dean, who had died young but had meant a lot to both of us. He showed our son a picture of Dean from his younger days, expecting confusion or disinterest, but instead, our son's eyes widened. "That's him," he said without hesitation. That's the boy from my room. He was in the water. My ex said he nearly dropped the phone. He tried to stay calm and told our son that Dean had indeed passed away in the water and that maybe he had just come to say hello. My son smiled and said, I know. He's very smiley. And he told me that water can be dangerous. Even now, retelling it, I get chills. How could he have known? The boy in his vision, or whatever it was, matched the picture of Dean perfectly, down to the length of his hair. And more than that, he described the exact manner of his death without ever being told. He wasn't scared. He wasn't confused. He just accepted it as a matter-of-fact truth. Dean had visited him, smiled and left. I suppose in some way that might be comforting. Maybe Dean felt connected to our son through more than just a name. Maybe his passing found a kind of peace in that connection, in the way life continued on the very date it had once ended. Since then, nothing quite like it has happened again, at least not that my son has mentioned, but I've noticed subtle changes in him. He seems more thoughtful sometimes, more in tune with things most kids would overlook. He'll stop to talk to trees, hum songs he's never heard, or mention dreams about places he's never been. I watch him and wonder if he sees things I can't. Hears things the rest of us have long forgotten how to listen for. It's strange how life works, how death can echo into the living, how memories can find new homes in new hearts. I've learned not to dismiss what I don't understand. Not everything has to be explained. Some things are meant to be felt, respected, carried quietly in our bones. I've stopped trying to rationalize what happened that night, whether it was a dream, a vision, or something far beyond human understanding. I choose to believe that Dean meant no harm, that he simply wanted to say hello, to watch over the boy who carries his name, who shares his day, and who may, just maybe, carry a piece of his spirit. And now, every year on July 13th, I light a candle, not just for my son's birthday, but for the boy from the water, for Dean. We remember him not with sadness, but with warmth, because somehow, across the veil that separates life from death, he found a way to reach through, and in doing so, he left behind something pure, something untouched by fear or pain. He left behind a moment, a connection, that reminds us love doesn't end with loss. Sometimes it simply changes shape. Story 7. The man at the train tracks. Working the late shift had become a rhythm I had grown used to. My job ended around 1 a.m., most nights, and by then, the streets were hushed, emptied of the usual chaos, leaving behind only the glow of streetlights and the sound of my own engine humming beneath me. There were 2 main ways home. One route led me directly to the highway, and the other wound through town, over a set of train tracks near a few late-night food spots. I often chose the latter, not only for a quick bite at the 24-hour burger joint nearby, but because it felt more familiar, less desolate. That night, I was hungry and decided to grab a burger before heading home. I got into my car, music playing softly from my phone, and began pulling out of the lot when something caught my attention. A large spider had spun its web between my side mirror and the door. I'm not a fan of spiders, but since it was outside, I decided to just keep my window up and ignore it. As I approached the train crossing, the red lights started to flash and the barriers lowered. I slowed to a stop, waiting for the distant rumble of the train. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. A man, looking disheveled and sunken, was standing uncomfortably close to my car. His hair was matted, his clothes grimy, and his eyes, though I barely saw them, seemed vacant. My heart skipped, but I stayed still, hoping he'd move on. We had a few homeless people in the area, but they usually didn't bother anyone. This man, however, didn't walk past. Instead, he moved directly to my driver's side and pulled on the handle. I froze, thankful that my doors locked automatically when I started the car. But the fear began to rise in my throat when he started banging on the window, screaming incoherent words and demanding I let him in. Panic surged through me. My first instinct was to reach for my phone and call the police, but in my haste, it slipped from my hand and fell between the seat and the center console. My fingers clawed blindly for it as he continued to pound on the glass, now circling to try the other doors, shouting things I couldn't understand. My mind raced. I had a nightstick under the seat, but in my fear, I forgot it was even there. My heart pounded against my chest as I finally managed to grab my phone and call 911, my voice shaking as I gave the dispatcher my location. I told them he was trying to break in and begged them to send someone fast. The train had passed, the barrier had lifted, but I couldn't bring myself to move. If I drove forward, I risked hitting him. If I stayed, I might get pulled out of the car. I felt paralyzed. Then, things escalated. He climbed onto the hood of my car, slamming his fists on the windshield, screaming now with unfiltered rage. I shrank back into my seat, unsure if the glass would hold. The dispatcher remained on the line, calmly telling me to stay in the car, assuring me help was on the way. It couldn't have been more than a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, flashing blue lights appeared behind me. The man noticed too. He jumped off the car and darted away into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the nearby trees. One of the officers chased him on foot, while the other approached my car, motioning for me to pull over to the burger lot. My hands were trembling as I did so. The officer spoke gently, asking me questions and trying to calm me down. I answered as best I could, still shaken, still trying to process what had just happened. He told me I had done everything right by staying in the car and calling for help. Then, almost offhandedly, he said, "Good thing your window wasn't down." And it hit me. If it weren't for that spider, I would have had the window open. He could have reached in. He could have done anything. It was such a small detail, so insignificant at the time, yet it may have saved me from whatever intentions that man had. I nodded, the thoughts settling into my bones like ice. They didn't find him that night. Too many hiding spots in the wooded area nearby. Too much darkness to search effectively, but they promised to increase patrols around the tracks during those late hours. I didn't go for burgers that night. I didn't go anywhere. I just drove straight home, locked every door behind me, and sat in silence. My hands shook long after I had crawled into bed. Every time a shadow moved outside the window, I jumped. I kept thinking about how quickly it all happened. How someone could appear out of nowhere and turn an ordinary night into something out of a nightmare. I kept hearing the sound of fists on glass, the desperate edge in his voice, the emptiness in his eyes. I knew I was lucky. It could have been so much worse, but that didn't make it any easier to forget. Over the next few days, I tried to push it out of my mind, but small things kept reminding me. The spider's web on my car stayed for a while, and I let it. A strange sort of gratitude formed in my chest toward that little creature. It had, unknowingly, kept me safe. Every time I drove past that train crossing, I felt my stomach twist. I found myself avoiding that route altogether. Even the burger place lost its appeal. What once was familiar had become stained by fear. But more than anything, I became more cautious about where I parked, what time I left, and what paths I took home. Eventually, the police called to follow up. They hadn't caught him, but similar incidents had been reported. A man lurking near the tracks, harassing late-night drivers, possibly under the influence or mentally unwell. They assured me again that I had done everything I could, that I had stayed calm, but I didn't feel calm. I felt watched, even in my own car. And it wasn't just the fear of that man, it was the fear of how quickly everything can change. 1 second you're listening to music and thinking about fries, and the next, you're dialing for help while someone screams at you through glass. Now, months later, I still think about that night more than I'd like to admit. I try to remind myself that I'm okay, that I was lucky, that I'm safe, but safety doesn't always feel solid. Sometimes it feels like a spider's web, fragile, delicate, and hanging by a thread you didn't even know was there. And sometimes, that thread is the only thing standing between you and something you may never fully understand. Story 8. The house by the indigenous graveyard. When I was a child, maybe around 7 or 8 years old, my family moved to a remote part of northern Canada. We lived deep in the forest, where the trees grew tall and close together, and the sky always seemed dimmer, as though the sun struggled to reach us. The house we moved into was enormous and ancient, worn by time and weather. It was more than 2 hours from the nearest town, and in every direction, there was nothing but wilderness. But the strangest thing about that house wasn't its size or its age. It was where it stood. Just 20 feet from our front door was an old, overgrown indigenous graveyard. There were no fences, no signs, only rows of moss-covered stones and forgotten markers disappearing into the trees. Even as a child, I knew better than to walk into that space. I would sit at the edge sometimes, watching it, wondering who had once been laid to rest there. The house had no electricity or running water. It was far too remote for utility lines to reach, so we relied on lanterns, firewood, and the river nearby for water. My dad raised cattle and spent most of his time either out in the barn or traveling back and forth to my grandparents' ranch nearly an hour away. My mother did her best to maintain a sense of normalcy, cooking on the wood stove and reading to us by candlelight. But even in the early days, the house didn't feel normal. It felt heavy. There were rooms we didn't use, corners that stayed cold even in summer, and creaks in the floorboards that didn't match our footsteps. But the first real sign that something wasn't right came one winter afternoon, when my dad was working in the barn. He'd gone outside to feed the animals, leaving the main door open behind him. The wind picked up suddenly and slammed it shut with such force that it locked from the outside. He shouted, thinking one of us had come to mess with him, but no one responded. He pounded on the wood, calling our names for nearly 20 minutes before, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. No one was there. He told us about it later, laughing it off as a gust of wind or a faulty latch, but his eyes told a different story. Not long after we began to hear it, the chanting. My mother and I were inside preparing dinner when the sound drifted in from outside, rhythmic, low, and unmistakably human. It wasn't singing or howling, it was chanting, deliberate, purposeful. My mother froze, the spoon in her hand motionless over the pot. At first she laughed nervously, saying maybe my dad was playing a joke. But then, minutes later, his voice crackled over the radio. He was still at the ranch, nearly an hour away. That's when her face paled. We looked at each other, unsure of what to do. There was nothing outside, no lights, no footsteps in the snow, only the sound that lingered and then faded. Over time, the chanting would return. Not every night, but often enough that it became part of the house's rhythm. I would lie in bed next to my mother, both of us silent, listening to the steady beat of voices that came from the woods beyond the graveyard. They never came closer, but they never went away either. My little brother refused to sleep in his room. His door kept slamming shut in the middle of the night, without wind or cause. The moment he started sleeping in our parents' room, it stopped. We also began to see the lone wolf. It would pass through our property at night, always alone, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It never attacked our animals, never growled or approached. It just watched. I remember one night waking to find it standing the edge of the graveyard staring at the house. My dreams became filled with a woman I'd never seen before. She had long braids and wore a red dress. Sometimes she stood near the river, and other times she sat beside the graves, a dandelion tucked behind her ear. I told my aunt about her once, and she brushed it off as imagination. But to me, she felt real, more real than most people. When I closed my eyes, I could see her clearly, feel her presence, calm yet distant, like she was waiting for something. Then came the night I broke down in tears, crying uncontrollably about dying. It came out of nowhere, no nightmare, no illness, just an overwhelming fear that settled over me like a weight. My mother held me until I calmed down, whispering that everything was okay. But the fear stayed with me for days, lingering in the corners of the house like smoke. I tried not to talk about it. I tried to be brave, but the house knew. It always knew. After a few years, we left that place, moving to a different province entirely. Life returned to something resembling normal. The chanting was replaced by traffic. The graveyard was replaced by sidewalks. But the memory of that house stayed in me like a splinter buried deep beneath the skin. Almost 20 years later, I found myself in a Reiki session for my daughter. I hadn't spoken of the house in years, not even to my partner, but halfway through the session, the therapist paused. She said she could feel something around me, a strong indigenous spiritual presence. She didn't know my past. She had never met me before that day, but she looked at me with such certainty and said, "They've accepted you. They were around you as a child. They've been with you since. my breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to say. She smiled gently and continued the session as though she hadn't just dropped a truth I hadn't dared voice out loud. I think about them sometimes, the voices, the wolf, the woman in the red dress. I wonder if the graveyard ever found peace. I wonder if the people buried there ever told their stories. I don't know why we were allowed to stay, why we were watched but never harmed, but I believe now that it wasn't anger that filled that land. It was memory. It was the presence of lives once lived, still echoing in the trees and water, and maybe somehow I became a part of that story. Not by choice, but by proximity, by openness, by quiet understanding. The land saw me, and I saw it back. To this day, I feel their presence, not as fear, but as something older, wiser, something that transcends time. I don't walk in graveyards anymore. I don't try to find them, but I feel them still, in dreams, in songs, in moments of stillness when the world seems to hold its breath. And when that happens, I close my eyes, whisper a quiet thank you, and let the silence wrap gently around me like an old friend returned. Story 9. The roommate who wasn't there. It was my first semester living off campus. After 2 years in dorms, I'd found a quiet little house to rent with 3 other students. The rent was reasonable, the neighborhood was peaceful, and the house had character. Old hardwood floors, vintage windows, and the kind of creaky charm that only an aging building could offer. My room was on the 2nd floor, tucked at the end of the hallway. Across from me was another bedroom that belonged to one of my new roommates, a girl named Clara. She was quiet, polite, and rarely around. Most of the time, she stayed at her boyfriend's place, which meant the room across from mine was usually dark and undisturbed. Occasionally I'd hear her come in late, rustling around, or hear soft footsteps padding across the hallway at night. We didn't talk much, but I didn't mind the arrangement. It was peaceful, predictable. A few weeks into the semester, I started noticing strange things. It began subtly. I'd hear the shower running in the early hours of the morning, long before any of us usually woke up. Sometimes I'd pass the bathroom, and it would be steamy, as if someone had just finished. But when I'd ask my roommates, they'd all say they hadn't used it. Once or twice, I noticed the door to Clara's room, slightly ajar even when she was supposedly staying at her boyfriend's. I assumed maybe she had come back during the night and left early, and I never gave it much thought until the noises began. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Soft footsteps, drawers opening and closing, the occasional quiet hum of someone singing, the kind of domestic sounds you only notice when everything else is quiet. One night I was up late studying. It was after 2 a.m. and the house was still. I was about to go to bed when I heard it. A creaking floorboard, then a soft thud, like someone had dropped something. I stepped out into the hallway and looked toward Clara's room. The door was slightly open, and the light inside flickered like a candle. My heart skipped. I walked over, knocked gently, and called her name. No answer. I pushed the door open a bit more and peered in. The room was empty. Dark. No light. No movement. Just her neatly made bed and the faint scent of lavender from a reed diffuser she kept on the windowsill. The hair on my arms stood on end. I backed away, closed the door, and returned to my room, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks on me after too much caffeine and too little sleep. The next morning I ran into one of our other roommates, Maya, in the kitchen. I casually asked if Clara had stayed over the night before. Maya shook her head. No, she's been at Jason's for like 3 days now. Why? I hesitated, then laughed it off. Just thought I heard her come in. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone in the hallway. Over the next few days the odd occurrences continued. I'd find the bathroom door locked when no one was inside. The kitchen light would be on when I knew I'd turned it off. And once, I heard someone whispering in the hallway, just outside my door, in the middle of the night. I opened it immediately, but the hallway was empty. Clara's door, as always, was closed. It all came to a head one weekend when everyone was out of town except me. I had the house to myself, and was actually enjoying the solitude. I spent the day watching movies, catching up on work, and relaxing. That night, I settled into bed around midnight. At some point, I woke up to the distinct sound of soft humming, low and melodic, coming from Clara's room. It wasn't scary, just strange. I waited, thinking maybe she had come back unexpectedly. I texted her, just to be sure. "Hey, are you home tonight?" A minute later, the reply came, "Nope, still at Jason's." "Why?" I stared at my screen, my throat dry. The humming continued. I stepped out quietly and crept toward her room. The door was closed, but light spilled from underneath. I reached out, hand trembling, and knocked softly. The humming stopped. The light blinked out. I stood there frozen, the silence louder than the noise that had come before. The next morning, I finally told everyone what had been happening. Maya went pale. She confessed she'd felt weird energy from Clara's room since the start, but hadn't wanted to freak anyone out. Our other roommate, Tom, rolled his eyes, insisting it was just drafts, creaky pipes, and late-night paranoia. But the next night, he slept on the couch downstairs. None of us wanted to be near that room anymore. Eventually, Clara moved out. She and Jason found a place together, and she was happy to leave. After she left, her room sat empty for weeks. None of us wanted to take it. It felt cold in a way no heater could fix. Once, Maya and I went in to clean it, and we both heard what sounded like a woman sighing. We left and didn't go back. We never learned the history of the house. There were no news articles, no tragic backstories we could find, but there was something about that room, something that didn't want to be forgotten. Eventually, a new tenant moved in. She was cheerful and upbeat, unfazed by our vague warnings. She repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and filled the space with sunlight and energy. For a while, things seemed normal. The noises stopped. The lights behaved. But one day she came downstairs and asked casually, "Do any of you hum when you're in the hallway at night?" We didn't answer. We didn't need to. She never asked again. Some places hold on to moments, to memories, to the people who once filled their walls. Sometimes those echoes are gentle, harmless. Other times they wait quietly behind doors, reminding you that presence doesn't require flesh or breath. I still wonder who or what it was, living quietly beside us, hiding in the humbled wood and whispers, and I wonder if, even now, it still walks the hallway, waiting for the next roommate, who will hear the song of someone who was never truly there. Story 10. The Forest Whispers Back. My grandfather's cabin sat deep in the woods of Oregon, nestled far from any town or cell signal, surrounded by dense pine and quiet. When I was younger, my family used to visit every summer, spending a week unplugged and secluded, away from the noise of everyday life. The drive was long and winding, the last leg of it on dirt roads so overgrown with branches and brush that they barely resembled roads at all. But when we arrived, the cabin always welcomed us with its familiar creaks, the scent of old wood, and a wide porch that looked out toward a stretch of trees that seemed to go on forever. I loved it there. At least I did, until the year I turned 16. That summer changed everything. That summer, I learned the forest doesn't always keep its silence. It started with something small. A sound. Late one night, I was reading by lantern light while the rest of the family had gone to bed. The air was still, the kind of heavy silence that presses against your ears. That's when I heard it. A single knock on the wooden wall behind my bed. Just one. Nothing more. I froze listening. I figured it was a branch falling or a small animal. The woods were full of movement at night. After all. But then came another knock, hours later, on the other side of the cabin, and again, the next night. Always a single knock, never followed by anything else. I didn't tell anyone at first. It felt silly. But I began keeping track of the knocks, writing down the times and where they occurred. They followed a pattern, moving clockwise around the cabin night after night, as if something was circling, waiting. One evening I was outside chopping wood when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, far off in the trees, just standing there. At first I thought it might be a hiker, but something felt off. They didn't move. They didn't wave. Just stood there, half shrouded by shadows. I blinked, and they were gone. I walked into the woods the next day, trying to find a trail, a footprint, anything, but the ground was undisturbed. the forest silent as ever. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me like humidity. That night, I mentioned the knocking to my grandfather. He went quiet, his eyes lowering, and then he simply said, "You hear it too, then?" That shook me. He told me that for as long as he'd owned the cabin, the woods had always whispered. He'd learned not to answer, not to go looking. As the nights passed, the knocking became louder. It wasn't just knocks now, it was whispers, faint, like wind through leaves, but unmistakably voices. Sometimes they sounded like murmurs, other times like someone calling my name from just beyond the trees. My parents thought it was wind, or dreams, or maybe just nerves. But I knew what I heard. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stepped out onto the porch with a flashlight and followed the sound into the woods. I walked slowly, my beam cutting through the dark like a blade. Every step I took, the whispers grew louder, surrounding me from every side. I called out, just once, asking if someone was there. The forest fell dead silent. That kind of silence doesn't happen naturally. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath. Then, the knocking returned right behind me, on the nearest tree trunk. I spun around, and the beam of my flashlight landed on something that didn't belong. A mark carved deep into the bark, a symbol I didn't recognize, like an eye surrounded by jagged lines. I stumbled back, heart racing, and ran all the way back to the cabin. I told my grandfather what I had seen, and his face grew pale. He disappeared into the back room and returned with an old, worn book full of hand-drawn symbols. He flipped through until he found a matching mark. "Forest wood," he said, "used by tribes in these parts long ago. They marked trees to warn others not to enter." I asked why the warnings were here, around our cabin. He didn't answer. He just closed the book and told me to never follow the voices again. The rest of the trip, I stayed close to the cabin, but the forest didn't forget. The knocking became more frequent, more insistent. On the last night, I woke to find muddy footprints on the porch, bare, human-sized, and leading right up to the front door before disappearing. My grandfather burned sage, muttered words in a language I didn't recognize, and left offerings near the trees. We left the next morning, and I never returned. That summer haunted me long after. I had dreams of the forest, of whispers, symbols, and eyes watching from the shadows. I could never shake the feeling that I had invited something to notice me, something ancient and patient. My grandfather died a few years later. I inherited the cabin, but I've never set foot back there. Sometimes, when I'm alone and the wind moves through the trees outside my home, I swear I hear that same knock, soft, distant, but there. A quiet reminder that the woods never forget, and perhaps they never truly let go. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was wildlife, echoes, tricks of an old house, but deep down I know the truth. The forest saw me, and once it sees you, it does not look away. My grandfather called it the forest's memory. He said some places are alive in ways we can't measure, carrying the weight of things long past. And sometimes, when you walk their paths or sleep in their shadows, you become part of their story, whether you want to or not. If you ever find yourself in a cabin deep in the woods, and you hear a knock that has no echo and no source, don't answer it. Don't ask who's there. Don't step into the trees, because what answers back might not be from this world. It might just be the forest remembering and calling you home.